Good evening. Just, 2 days left to the holiday of Shavuos, a yontif that many of us are going to be celebrating in ways very, very different than we ever had before. I'd like to talk about the idea of how to approach a yontif, a holiday like Shavuos in general, and I'd like to talk about in specific how that is different and in some ways hopefully better this year for those of us that are still in relative state of isolation. So for a starting point, we're familiar with the fact that in our tefillos, in our prayers, we refer to Shavuos as Man Matan Torasenu, as the time, the day in which our Torah was given. Many ask the question that it would seem that it would be more significant to recognize that day as not the day that the Torah was given, but the day that we received it. Matan Torasenu, the giving of the Torah, is talking about what Hashem did. What's even more significant for us and more relevant for us is the fact that it was the day that we received it. Why the focus on the giving? One of the common answers our sages have given to this is that we did not want to speak about that day in history as the day that the Jews received the Torah, because the idea of Kabbalah Torah, of receiving the Torah, is an ongoing phenomenon. Hashem gave the Torah once, some 3 millennium ago. But each year, and perhaps each day of our lives, we have the opportunity to receive the Torah, to accept the Torah. And therefore, Zaman Kabbalah's Torah Seinu, the receiving is not a time that was, it's a time that is. Which begs the question, how do we receive anew the Torah? How do we receive more Torah, a greater piece of the Torah, or accept the Torah anew each year in general, and particularly each Shavuos? I think that we would think intuitively that if I wanted to muster a sense of acceptance of Torah, I should focus on, I should fill my day and my mind with thoughts about how important Torah is, Chashivas HaTorah, the value of Torah. If I want to accept more of the Torah, perhaps I should learn more of the Torah, know more of the Torah, Yedias HaTorah. Yet none of these are the core elements that we focus on. None of it is the essential way in which we are to receive the Torah this year. And in fact, it's not the way that the Jews in Midbar Sinai at Sinai received the Torah. In fact, they didn't prepare to receive the Torah by learning about it. They knew very little about the Torah before it was given. How did they prepare? So there's a fascinating, fundamental commentary of the Orach Chaim. The great Orach Chaim HaKadosh writes, in Perek Yud Tes, when the Torah describes, and this is read in synagogues that are reading the Torah on Shavuos, we read the beginning of Perek Yud Tes, chapter 19, of the book of Shemos, the book of Exodus. B'chodesh hashlishi, l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, bo'u, b'yom hazeh bo'u midbar Sinai. On the first day of the month of Sivan, the Jews arrived at Midbar Sinai, the Sinai desert. The next pasuk tells us, and this is the one I want to talk about, Vayisu me-Refidim, they left Refidim, Vayavohu Midbar Sinai, they came to the Sinai desert, Vayachanu b'Midbar, and they camped there. Vayichan Yisrael neged Ohar, and they camped next to the mountain. Why is the Torah in Pasuk Beis, in the second verse, telling us that the Jews left Refidim and came to the Sinai desert? Already in the previous verse, the Torah told us that they came to Midbar Sinai. And we know that they were in Refidim. So if they came to the Sinai desert, they obviously left Refidim. This is an enigmatic pasuk, an enigmatic verse. The Orach Chaim tells us that in this second verse, the Torah is giving us the three ways in which the Jews prepared themselves to be able to receive the Torah at Sinai. Step one, Vayisu me-Refidim. They left Refidim. What was Refidim? So we already saw in the Torah that Vayilachem Amalek im Yisrael b'Refidim. The Torah tells us that it was at Refidim that the Jews were attacked by Amalek, by the Amalekites. Chazal sages tell us, what is the reference of Refidim? What does it mean that they were attacked at Refidim? So our sages tell us that Refidim, the word Refidim is not merely a name of a place in their journeys, but it means a rifion, yodayim. It means a loosening up of their hands. It means that they relaxed in their focus on Torah. And therefore, says the Orach Chaim, when the Jews arrived at the Sinai desert, they learned the lesson that when they lose the intensity of their connection with Torah, their anticipation in that case of receiving the Torah, the results were the threat of Amalek, the danger of the battle with Amalek. Vayisu me-Refidim, they left that. They left the loosening, the lightening. They intensified their anticipation and their appreciation of the Torah that was to come. Vayavohu Midbar Sinai, the Torah repeats the fact that they came to Midbar Sinai, says the Orach Chaim, to give us the second way in which they prepared themselves. The concept of Midbar is a fascinating concept. It always struck me as so intriguing. The Christians call the fourth book of the Torah Numbers. We call it Bamidbar. The Christians changed the name. I don't believe there's a Torah source that calls the book, the fourth book of the Torah, Numbers. Certainly, the vast majority of our sages call it Bamidbar. Why did they change it? I can only speculate that they thought it rather nonsensical to call a book of the Torah desert. Why call desert? It happened to begin in the desert, but that was peripheral to their thinking. The theme of the book was numbers, census, the many, many different census that they took in the desert. That was something that they found meaning in. And certainly if there is a sage, because all of our sages don't ascribe the same names to all the books. But the vast majority call it Bamidbar, not because it's one of the words in the first pasuk, in that first verse, but because the concept of desert is significant to us. The fact that the Torah was given in the desert, specifically in a desert, says the Orach Chaim, mirroring the comments of so many of our Chazal, so many of our sages. Midbar, desert, represents a character traits. It represents a place of humility. It represents a desert is something that's open to all. No private territories, no private lawns. A desert is very simple. A desert is tread upon and dust of the earth to all who walk upon it. The Torah was given in a midbar, in a desert, to teach us that a person needs humility, needs character, refined midos, great character traits in general, to be able to accept and live a life of Torah, and particularly humility. This was the second way in which the Jews prepared with humility to receive the Torah. And the verse then continues to the third aspect, Vayichan Yisrael neged Ohar, those very familiar words to us, that they encamped next to the mountain in a singular Vayichan, not Vayachanu, as if one person was camped there, not a multitude of 3 millions. Ke'ish echad b'lev echad, like one person with one heart. There was a unity, an achdus, a unity with which the Torah was accepted. And these are the 3 ways in which the Jews prepared for Torah, for the receiving of the Torah. And this, in general, gives us, first of all, a concept that I find very instructional to understanding how, in general, we can receive more Torah. Many times we want to grow in Torah, we want to be stronger in Torah. And how do we do it? Where do we find, what do we focus on? So I like to use a metaphor, a marshal, a metaphor that, to my mind, crystallizes this concept of how to prepare, how to make ourselves a better receptacle to grow in Torah. And to me, it's reflected in the insight, in the way in which I, after many, many years of struggling, finally learned to water ski. I used to love water skiing. But I made 2 mistakes for many, many years. First, I was too cheap. I used to go to the Catskills, and I used to rent these little outboard boats with, 15 horsepower, 20 horsepower, I don't remember, because the other boats were very expensive. And the boat just didn't have the power to pick me up, even before I got so heavy. So I first had to learn that when something is valuable, it's worth spending a little extra money on it. The second thing I did is, after years of getting up and falling and getting up and falling, and most of the time not even getting up, but falling on my way up, I finally got an instructor. And he gave me 1 minute of advice that got me water skiing. He said, don't pick yourself up. In order to water ski, what you do is you get yourself in the right position. Put your knees this way. Put your arms that way. And you just hold the end of the rope, get yourself in the right place, and then the boat will just pull you up. And it was a game changer. It was amazing. I had a big enough boat. I got myself in place, and the boat picked me up. And I think this is a game changer too, in terms of growth in Torah. We need a powerful motor to pull us up. But you know something? We have a powerful motor. Each and every one of us has a neshama tahora, a neshama, a soul that is pure and pristine. And it connects, it's a piece of godliness, and it connects to the heavens. And it yearns to soar. And you know why it falls on its face like I did time and time again? Because we fight it. And even when we're trying to do what we think is right, we're fighting it. Kabbalah Torah, receiving, growing in Torah, is all about just working on ourselves, getting ourselves, number one, step one, is Vayisu Merafidim. Each and every one of us needs to be engaged in learning. Not just to learn, but to learn Torah in a way in which we are engaged, we are involved. It is filling our minds. We have to find a piece of Torah, a speaker of Torah, a teacher of Torah, a book of Torah that speaks to us. And we have to delve with that person, with that study partner, or with that book. And we have to leave refidim. Torah is not to be read, it's to be learnt. We make the blessing, La'asok b'divrei Torah. We make a blessing every morning, not over the learning of Torah, the knowledge of Torah, but the asek, the toil of Torah. Step two, and this is the key and critical step, is to work on our midos in general, to work on our character traits, and in specific with our humility. It is not coincidental that Moshe, the receiver and the giver of Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu, just didn't happen to be the humblest person who ever lived. The greatness of his humility, the fact that he reached the greatest levels of humility, allowed him to reach the highest levels of Torah study and Torah teaching and Torah dissemination. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz brings several cases to explain how the character trait of humility is central to being able to grow in Torah. He talks about the Gemara in Pesachim. Let me give you a source on it. In Pesachim Samech Vav, page 66, in Tractate Pesachim. The Gemara talks about Hillel. Our sages tell us, Leolam, a person should strive to be as humble as Hillel. We all have heard the amazing stories of Hillel's humility. And yet the Gemara in Pesachim tells us that how did Hillel become the Nasi? How did Hillel become the head of the Torah nation? Because the Bnei Beseira forgot a halacha. They made a mistake in a halacha. The leading sages of the generation before him made a mistake, and he knew that halacha that they did not know. And he corrected them, And everyone saw his amazing wisdom, and they appointed Hillel to be the head, the Nasi. But shortly thereafter, something happened, and he displayed a small, slight haughtiness. I wouldn't call it haughty, but he did something that was less than fully humble. And the Talmud, the Gemara tells us in Pesachim, because of this, he forgot the next halacha. The same thing we find by Moshe. Moshe was the humblest of all people. Yet the Torah tells us that when a person comes to anger, he forgets the Torah that he knows. When a person yields to anger, his judgment and his knowledge and his intellect become skewed, become cloudy. And we learn this out from Moshe, that Moshe Rabbeinu became angry at Elazar and Itamar, the sons of Aaron, and because of that, he forgot a halacha, he forgot a law, and he made a mistake. And the Talmud tells us, Reb Chaim points out that even though he wasn't wrong in getting angry, he had a right in that situation to get angry at Aaron's children, even though he did nothing wrong. But just like a person puts a finger in the fire, whether you did it on purpose or by accident, whether you had reason that you had to put your hand in the fire for some who knows what reason, fire burns. The reality of fire in this world is that you put something in fire, it burns. The reality of anger and haughtiness, even if they're called for, is it skews our judgment. And the Torah we have is lost. Says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, if we can't maintain the Torah we have, when we lack humility, when we yield to anger, how much more so can we no longer be a receptacle to receive more Torah? This is what the Orach Chaim is telling us when the Orach Chaim says, Vayavu Midbar Sinai. The Torah is stressing the fact that the Torah was given to us in the Sinai desert in a place of humility, in a place that bespeaks and teaches humility, because each of us on our level, to the extent that we humble ourselves to others, to the extent that we control our arrogance and our anger, to that extent, we become a receptacle. Now we're ready to water ski. Now we're ready for our neshama to pull us up. But when we allow the blemishes, and to the extent that we allow the blemishes of our character flaws that we all have, to the extent that we allow them in, we push Torah out. And the third and last aspect, the third way in which they prepared, was Vayicha Neged Ahar, that unity, that Achdus. What does Achdus mean? What does unity mean? What does it mean 3 million people camped together? What makes Achdus? What makes unity? Unity is not people together. It's people thinking together. People viewing the klal, the community, the nation, as more important than themselves. When 3 million people stand somewhere, when 10 of us stand somewhere, when 2 of us stand somewhere, and we're each thinking about ourselves, then we're just a bunch of people standing together. But when, and to the extent that we yield to others, that we prioritize others over ourselves, the next person over ourselves, our spouse, our friend, our child, our parent, our neighbor, our community, our nation. It's not that we make time for the needs of others. We have to prioritize others and then make time for ourselves. We have to make time for ourselves. We have to be good to ourselves. But life very easily could be all about me, and one of the things I do is care about others. No. Unity is caring, is feeling, is prioritizing others and the community at large over ourselves. These are three directions, three legs upon which to build our ability to grow in Torah. Let's talk a little bit before I close and open up your mics for questions and comments. Let's talk about what it means. Many of us this year are going to be relatively or largely alone for Shavuos. For many of us, we were used to celebrating with the community. And we will be perhaps alone and by ourselves. Is this not the way it was meant to be? Weren't we meant to receive the Torah together with a community, as a community? No, really not. But didn't the Jews at Sinai, they accepted the Torah all together with one heart, but all together? Actually not. In that most famous of psukim, of verses, that encapsulates the essence of how the Jews received the Torah. The Torah tells us, Vayud Tes Ches, the Torah tells us in the book of Shavuos, chapter 19, verse 8, Vayanu kol ha'am yachtov, vayomru kol asher diber Hashem naseh, vayoshe Moshe divrei olam el Hashem. The Torah tells us that the Jews all gathered yachtov, together. And they said, Naseh, and then Nishma. They said, we will accept the Torah, sight unseen. That phenomenal acceptance that caused the angels to exclaim, Mi golo rozel lebonai, who revealed this celestial secret to these mortal men to accept the Torah just because God is giving it to them with such a pure heart. So it says that they all did it yachtov. Does that mean together? Doesn't that mean in unison as a community? No, actually not. The Ibn Ezra says that the word yachtov, that they answered together, is a very special word. Because if they did it all jointly, it should say yachad. Vayanu kol ha'am yachad. It adds an extra vav, and that vav makes this a very special word used sparingly in the Torah. And says the Ibn Ezra, it means just the opposite. That the Jews answered singly, yachad, like a yochid, like an individual. Think about it. Hashem said, Moshe says Hashem is ready to give the Torah. What do you say? And everyone said, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh. Whatever he's giving, we're taking. They all said it at the exact same second. Yachtov, in unison. But if they did it at the same second, what that means is that they didn't wait to hear it from the next person. They didn't hear the next guy and yes, that's it. Each of them on their own received the Torah. Do you hear this? I was blown away recently. I'm sitting here contemplating my first Shavuos night since a young child beyond my memory, alone, by myself, without everybody else. And the Torah is telling us at Har Sinai, at Sinai, what did they do? They accepted the Torah as individuals. Some say it was a miracle that they were able to all do it in sync without hesitation. Others say that everyone was uplifted equally to that great level that they just all did it and it all came out at the same time. And it had to be that way, because if it would have not been in unison, then I would have heard him and say, oh yeah, I'm following him. Nobody followed. Everybody did it on their own. Kabbalah HaTorah, receiving the Torah, growing in Torah, is something that we have to do on our own. It's better on our own. It's real on our own. Let me share one more story with you. I may have told this to some of you. 35 years ago, when the center started. It was the first week in July that I left the yeshiva, and we created the Jewish Heritage Center. And I remember so vividly. I spent 2 months, July and August. There was nothing. It was exciting. It was engaging. It was uplifting. We took a vision and we laid the groundwork. We laid the pieces. And we started creating an organization, and we started creating classes. And we had to name ourselves and publicize ourselves and figure ourselves out. And for 2 months, you're not eating, you're not sleeping, you're just building Torah. It was one of the most exciting 2 months of my life. My life. I only have one life. And I'll never forget, it was end of the summer, maybe 2 months later, and I stopped for a moment, I looked at myself, and I felt my spiritual level had dropped. In my heart of hearts, I had a sense that my spirituality was just not the same. I had spent 14 years in yeshiva, learning and studying and growing. And I left. But I left for what? I left to build Torah. And I was busy building Torah. And I didn't have time to get involved in too much crazy stuff. Why am I losing it? And I realized something. That I've never forgotten. I never lost anything. I didn't drop. Every one of us has 2 levels. We have one level, one madrega, one level in which we are when we are with everyone else, when we're in a strong community, when we're among others doing mitzvahs, when we're among others that are learning. When I was in the yeshiva for all of those years, yes, I was in a different place, but I was in that place because of everything around me. At the end of the summer, when I had no more yeshiva, and out of its walls and out of its cocoon and out of that community, was close at hand. But I came to the fact that this is Moshe Turk without everybody around. Moshe Turk with his Rabbi, Moshe Turk with his study partners, Moshe Turk with everyone around him is here. But really, that wasn't Moshe Turk. Moshe Turk himself is here. Both levels are real. It doesn't mean it's false when you're on a level with other people. There's, even with everyone around, we're all on different levels, right? It's a madrega. It's a level to reach a certain place with the help of community and environment, positive environment. And we need that to the extent that we can plug into that. But we have to remember that there's another level, a level of ourselves when we're alone. And that's a truer level, a deeper level. It strikes me that this coronavirus, the pandemic that we have been going through and continue to go through, this level of isolation that all of us are experiencing, it appears to me that this might not be antithetical to the way to receive Torah. It might help us in two ways. Number one, I'm thinking that just like the Jews at Sinai, just like at Har Sinai, their actual acceptance of Torah was an acceptance that each one had to make on his own, from his heart. How far from your heart can you go? How connected to God are each of us on our own? That's the level that they all were at and reached at Sinai. And then they had achdus and unity, and then they did it in unison with everybody else, because everyone else also was lifting themselves that way. But the other thing I'm thinking about is that sometimes it's hard to know how much of what I'm doing at any given moment is rock solid, and how much of it is only what I could do when I have that support around me. Coronavirus has maybe given some of us, isolation has maybe given some of us an ability to measure that difference, which is sometimes very elusive, because normally we live our whole lives with society, and we don't have the time to be with ourselves as much. It appears to me that there are two questions that we maybe could ask ourselves this Shavuos. In alone, in our rooms, each of us by ourselves. I plan to sit down and think the following. My project this Yom Tov personally is to think, what areas have I dropped? Now that I've not been going, and especially as we begin to re-enter synagogue life, we begin to hopefully be re-entering communal life. While it's still fresh in our minds, and even those of us that perhaps are already getting into phase one of re-entry, before we forget, let's think about number one. What areas have I not been, or am I not as strong in? This is now a barometer of what I am when I don't have that help. How can I reach, perhaps, strengthen, bridge that gap so that I can be there on my own, not just when other people are pulling me up? And conversely, I would say, in what areas have I been stronger? In what areas maybe our communal life pulling me down? For many of us in our isolation, we found certain strengths, we found certain pieces of ourself, perhaps, knowledges. let's take a look at those strengths now before we come fully out of isolation, before society opens up fully. Let's see the areas perhaps in which we've grown. And let's see how we can hold on to it as we re-enter society. We're now at the cusp. We're all there are many different time zones here. There are different states here. There are different places and different phases of re-entry in our group here tonight. I think that this is a particularly wonderful time. These are, I would dare say, these are central ways of approaching Kabbalas HaTorah, growth in Torah on Shavuos for every year. But I think this year more than any other year, I think this is an opportunity to focus now while it's clear, before things change. God willing, they're changing for the better. But let's use the insight we can. Let's focus on these two levels. The Moshe Turk with society, the Moshe Turk away from society. Let's think about that, contrast that, learn from that. And let's think about what the Or Chaim is telling us, that the way to grow in Torah is to grow ourselves, is to grow ourselves in three areas. Deepen our study of Torah. Every one of us needs, man, woman, and child, needs to be engaged daily in engaging study of Torah. We need to work on our humility, on our anger. We need to open ourselves up to be humbler individuals, to listen to others, to hear from others, to give to others. The more we reduce ourselves, the more we become open to receive more Torah and to focus on achdus and unity, and understand that although I need to do personal avoda, personal service on myself and my own growth, I need to prioritize others around me. That's the way we become bigger. By making other people bigger, we become bigger. Before I open the floor for questions, I want to take the opportunity to wish everybody, whatever state of opening up or whatever state of isolation you're in, I want to wish everyone a yontif, a holiday, a Shavuos that is joyous and that is meaningful. And may we each get just a little piece of growth this Shavuos over before, from this experience over the past. And may we merit to see great blessing in our lives and the blessings for our community and for the world at large that we so much need today.